Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Zapier and Linea by the Iconfactory. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hey, John, how are you?
I'm doing all right. We've got an interesting topic today. We're just fresh back from WWDC and thought we would talk a little bit about system apps and apps that compete with system apps.
Yeah, sounds fun.
Yeah, every year when there's a keynote, whether it's WWDC or the iPhone event in September, there's always that moment where Apple says something and there's a developer somewhere that says, oh no, I've been Sherlocked. My feature or my app is now been incorporated somehow into either Mac OS or iOS. And I can imagine that's a huge sense of dread. Yet at the same time, I think many of those apps actually do survive and have life after Sherlocking. For instance, there's been a lot of rumors over the years that Apple is going to do some sort of PDF viewer editor type app, like the preview app on the Mac, on iOS. And I think that if they were to do that PDF Pen, PDF Expert, PDF Viewer, all those mature, advanced PDF apps on iOS would be perfectly fine, because the thing is that Apple doesn't really address the more advanced market. I think that they'd be absolutely fine. It's also not that unusual for third-party developers to voluntarily step right into a category that Apple is already occupying, whether that's, Notes or Maps or the Mail app or podcasts. They just walk right in, which is almost like reverse Sherlocking. And despite the fact that Apple is the biggest corporation on the planet with more money than anyone could count, these developers survive, and some of them thrive. And I wanted to kind of explore today why that is. And it seems to me that the reason really lies in the approach that Apple takes to system apps. And that is, what they're trying to do is to create a core experience for the platform, one that appeals to the broadest group of people possible. And by doing that, they're limiting the functionality to those things that are the core features that everybody needs. And they want to keep it simple. They want to make it as usable as possible. But it leaves room for developers to address the pro and enthusiast markets, which is where the money actually is. Because the simpler apps, you're less likely to be able to make money in the first place. But if you can appeal to the pro user who needs something for their business, their work, getting things done, then they're more likely to be willing to pay for your app. So there's still a lot of variability, though, between the various systems apps. And that's one of the things that, when you step back and look at it on a broad basis, there are a couple of different categories. There are those simpler apps that are easier to implement for a third-party developer, even if it's a small indie shop, maybe like Notes, something like that, where there's a lot of competition and there are a lot of different apps available for users. But then there's a whole nother category, and that's a category that I think we're going to save for a later show, which are apps that are maybe more complex and also have major infrastructure on the back end. Things like Maps, for instance, or Safari, something where there's not as much competition, and it's in part because of the complexity, but also because of the system hooks, the hooks into the OS itself, as well as needing to have some sort of back-end infrastructure to support the underlying service. One interesting exception to this kind of broad-based difference between the kinds of system apps on iOS is Mail, though, because Mail is really interesting to me because it's both a system app that has tight hooks into the OS itself, and it requires a fairly complex back-end infrastructure to handle the mail with all the mail servers and everything. And yet it's an area where there is an incredible number of apps competing for users' business. And we'll talk a little later about why that might be. The other one that's a little different, I think, in my mind, is music. And I think music's been held back a little bit just because it's obviously you have to either have separate deals with music labels, or you have things like the Spotify API, which you can't make a Spotify app unless You make it a free app. There's no way to monetize that. So I think those sort of things hold music back a little bit. We thought today, with that in mind, that kind of broad overview, take a look at some of the system apps on iOS and talk a little bit about some apps that are doing things right and thriving on the App Store, notwithstanding the fact that there is an app that comes with every single phone for free. And I think I'll let you lead off, Federico.
So, a lot of Apple apps, they tend to satisfy, as you said, the basic needs of most people. And that's the reason why I believe Apple likes to keep apps like Notes, for example, or even the calendar as simple as possible and as clear as possible to make sure that everyone can use them. But the sort of the counter effect of this is that by keeping these apps simple, Apple leaves the door open to third-party developers to address different markets, and it's not just about the economics of the App Store. It's more about the needs of customers and the kind of people that use iOS devices, and also the differences between the iPhone and the iPad, pro users and more casual iOS users. And I believe a lot of developers are taking advantage of the very fact that Apple has a system app to build a more powerful alternative for other kinds of users with other kinds of needs. And at this point, I would say there's a lot of choice in categories of apps where Apple has a native app, a pre-installed app, and I thought I could start from Notes because Notes is, I believe, along with Messages and Safari and Music, probably one of the most used mobile apps worldwide among iPhone and iPad users. And there's a sort of continuum from note-taking apps, text editors, and word processors, and it can be difficult to understand the differences. And maybe this all-in-one approach of Notes was also made even stronger by Apple 2 years ago with iOS 9, where they increased the capabilities of Notes. And so they went from this rather simplistic note-taking app to a more powerful solution that can integrate links from Safari, file attachments like images and PDFs, and even audio clips. I was recently talking to a friend who told me that she's saving audio messages from WhatsApp into the Apple Notes app as an archive. And so I think Apple is trying to build this all-in-one note-taking app that can address a lot of different needs, that can deal with plain text and rich text, that has a bunch of different functionalities for archiving files and sharing them and protecting notes with Touch ID. But all of these features, they're done well, but they're not too advanced. And I think that's how some developers are trying to build more powerful and also more flexible and more advanced note-taking apps. And the first that comes to mind is Bear. Bear is by Italian studio Shiny Frog, and it's my current favorite third-party alternative to Apple Notes. Think of it as a more clean, minimalistic, and yet customizable Notes. It supports Markdown, so if you want, you can actually format text more quickly if you know the Markdown syntax. It's based on a subscription model, which is interesting because, for an indie note-taking app with Markdown support that kind of resembles a text editor, it's a bit unusual to have a subscription, but I think it works because it unlocks this pro version that allows you to have iCloud sync, that allows you to have multiple themes, even different icons on the home screen with iOS 10.3. And if you're a power user, you have these powerful features such as automation with X callback URL and workflow integration, and you have the ability to cross-reference notes with links. And there are so many little touches. You can change the typography, you can change all of these style settings, and it's stuff that is not available in Apple Notes. And I've been using Bear to archive travel documents, to collect, research for show notes for app stories. And I prefer it to Apple Notes in some ways because as an individual user, when it comes to sharing, I'm still heavy into Apple Notes because it's the only one with collaboration for notes using iCloud. But for individual usage, I very much prefer the Bear approach because it's got Markdown and all of these extra settings that I appreciate. There's also RunWriter, which is a text editor / note-taking app. I was using this app a few years ago, but I know, John, that you're still using this app.
Well, I'm actually not using it as much as I used to. I was using this when I started at Mac Stories and was actually using it as my main text editor at that point. And what I like about OneWriter is it's got lightning fast sync for large collections of notes. And I, at the time, had a very large collection of text notes that were in NVAlt on my Mac. And with OneWriter, I could point OneWriter at the same Dropbox folder, and it would sync back and forth, and there were never major conflict problems, and it always synced incredibly fast. And that was what really got me into it more than anything else. But it also has all kinds of power features that you can use, like a URL scheme and even JavaScript automation, which I know that you delved into at one point right before you moved over to Ulysses, right?
That's right. I was a OneWriter user, and I tried to learn JavaScript, but ultimately failed because time is always an issue. So eventually Workflow came out, and I just consolidated everything into Ulysses and Workflow. But anyway, in addition to Bear and OneWriter, there's also Drafts. Drafts is, one of our favorite note-taking apps at MacStories. It can be really considered the app that sort of invented iOS automation when it comes to note-taking, when it comes to Markdown automation. And the interesting thing about Drafts is that it can be the simplest note-taking app on the planet. It literally starts as a blank page with a keyboard, and that's it. But it can also be at the same time the most complex one. Once you unlock the power of its actions, the integrations, the URL scheme, connecting drafts with X callback URL to other apps, you can build this super complex and powerful typing experience that is connected to dozens of other apps through actions and automation. And it's really impressive, this balance between simplicity. It's even simpler than the Apple Notes app, but also 100 times more powerful and more integrated with other iOS apps. And finally, I thought we should mention that most text editors, in a way, they can be used as basic note-taking apps. Stuff like Ulysses, as I mentioned, which is the app where I write my articles for MacStories. You can actually use it if you want for note-taking. It's got support for text and images, and you can integrate it with other apps. There's also IA Writer, which is another excellent text editor with Markdown support. And even to an extent, file managers like Devonthink and maybe even Documents, they have support for creating text notes and saving images and saving attachments. So the thing about note-taking apps and alternatives to Notes is Apple Notes is an excellent default note-taking app with some features, namely iCloud collaboration and Touch ID protection, that are usually not found in third-party alternatives. But that's the thing, you can use both at the same time like I do. I use Apple Notes for collaboration and for sharing notes with other people like John, and I use Bear for the single individual usage when I want to have quicker Markdown formatting and editing, and when I want to do some research, and it's just faster to use Bear instead of Apple Notes.
Yeah, as with a lot of things, I think which of these will work for you best depends on how you work. One of the things that I love about Bear is that it has tagging, which I find myself pretty frequently in Apple Notes wanting to have access to a note in two places. I like to have a shared folder where I have all my shared notes, for instance, with you, Federico. But some of those relate to app stories. Some of those relate to Mac Stories Weekly. They relate to all different things. So I'd like to be able to have access to those in more than one place. But unfortunately, that's not really possible in Notes. And Bear doesn't have sharing yet. So, and I don't do notes in text editors like Ulysses, mainly because I've got enough stuff in there already, and I don't want to make it any more cluttered than it already sometimes gets. Thanks to Zapier for supporting App Stories. Zapier is easy automation for busy people. Zapier ties your web apps together, moving information between them automatically so you can focus on more important tasks. That's exactly how we use it here at MacStories. We're a small team with lots of different things going on, so Zapier lets us focus on creating content for the site, the club, and this podcast without getting bogged down in busy work. There are all sorts of cool things you can use Zapier for. Federico is using a Zap that monitors our MailChimp list for club subscribers. As soon as a newsletter goes out, Zapier extracts the email campaign URL, creates a task in his Todoist, and posts a link to our Slack channel. The URL is even processed using Zapier's run code action to properly encode it using Python. Federico then adds the issue to our archive page and creates a PDF that he stores in Devonthink to Go as a searchable database of past issues. Another cool Zap I looked at recently is the ability to share Google Calendar events in a Slack channel instead of having to remember to remind everyone in the channel of an upcoming event. Zapier lets you create workflows that automatically save Gmail attachments to a variety of cloud services too. The list just goes on because Zapier supports over 700 apps, including 17 of its own, for doing things like parsing text for emails, running workflows on a schedule, formatting or translating text, and much, much more. Zapier also supports detailed workflows with multiple steps and filters so that it only runs on the data that you need it to use. You might even say that Zapier makes you happier. It certainly does for us. Visit zapier.com/appstories for a 2-week free trial. Plans start at just $20 a month. Thanks again to Zapier for sponsoring the show.
The next obvious area of default apps with strong alternatives is reminders. Reminders is the kind of task manager and simple to do app that falls squarely into a category of apps where people have almost infinite demand for new takes on the same genre. And I believe this goes down as an example of we are all different. We all like to work in different ways. There's never going to be the definitive task manager that can be widely regarded as the best one, because we all have different brains and habits, and there's never going to be a single to-do app or a single task manager for every one of us. Some of us are individual users with just a few to-dos each day. Others are freelancers or creatives that maybe have a few projects. Other people use collaboration and sharing. And even other people, they work in larger teams, such as, for example, the McSorry's team on even bigger organizations. And so if you just go to the App Store and search for Task Manager or To Do, besides the hundreds of icons featuring a check mark, you're going to find some serious alternatives to reminders, going from the more approachable ones, such as Sorted, which has been inspired by Clear by Real Mac Software, to stuff like Things 3.0, which is a new version with a clean new Apple Music inspired design, and to the more complex solutions such as Todoist, which is the service that I use, OmniFocus, which is maybe the most popular Mac and iOS task manager for power users, To Do, which is another excellent choice that I was using before Todoist. And then maybe you can see also the more dedicated and different task managers, for example, family sharing apps such as Picnic, which is the service that I'm using now with my girlfriend, and AnyList. AnyList, it's a grocery shopping and also sort of list sharing task manager that it's meant for collaboration and sharing lists with other people. And then if you want to be sort of a hardcore users, there's stuff like Task Paper, which is a plain text way to manage your task, and you can use the task paper format on iOS with apps like Taskmater or Editorial, which is a text editor with a task paper mode. There's really hundreds and hundreds of possible alternatives to reminders. Some of them are simple, others are more advanced, and I'm sure there's always gonna be more to-do apps and more task managers because people are always going to come up with new ideas on how to manage the things you have to do. Another obvious example is the Apple Calculator app, which is pre-installed on the iPhone. For some reason, it's not on the iPad. Another obvious example is the Apple Calculator app, which for years has been only available on the iPhone. And there are so many possible choices. Again, like task managers, wherever you look, whether it's a new design or a calculator for power users or a slightly reimagined Apple calculator with more features, there's plenty of choice on the App Store. You go from traditional calculators with more features than the Apple one, such as pCalc, for example, or CalcBot by TapBots, the same guys behind TweetBot. And then you can also go with the non-traditional and more text-based maybe approaches, such as Calca and Solver. There are two free-form calculators that allow you to combine text like actual sentences with mathematical calculations. It's very innovative approaches. And also there's this app, sort of like mind mapping combined with calculators. It's called Tidlig, and I think it came out on the App Store a couple of years ago, and it's definitely unique and unlike anything else I've seen as calculators on iOS. there's so much choice when it comes to calculators, and especially on the iPad, developers have been able to complement the iPad experience, the multitasking experience, by offering calculators that you can use in split view, which is perfect when you're doing spreadsheets, for example, on the iPad Pro. So, like task managers, there's a lot of choice, there's a lot of options, and developers like James Thompson, they have been able to build entire businesses on top of a calculator, which is kind of impressive.
Another interesting category is music. The music app on iOS is very opinionated. It's got an interesting design. People tend to either love it or hate it. There are plenty of people who hate it. The theme among most of the alternative music players that I've seen is on filtering and sorting. So you have apps like Picky, and it says it right in the name. It's for people who are picky about how their music is displayed. It has an incredible array of choices when it comes to sorting and filtering your music. Acoot is another one that I know Federico has used in the past. It has a really nice design and also focuses on filtering. And then there's something like Cesium, which is incredibly customizable down to the color themes of the UI, as well as what tabs are shown on the bottom in terms of things like artists and albums and playlists and that sort of thing. Things that allow you to make the music app your very own. Podcasts is another app. This is an app. Apple didn't have a podcasts app for a long time, and some players have come into this market with podcasts already there. One of those that came in was Marco Arment's Overcast. Overcast came in after Apple's podcast app existed, and he implemented features like Smart Speed, which does a good job of shortening the pauses in between sentences during podcasts to make them play faster without distorting the audio, and Voice Boost. Both of those are features that you're probably never going to see in an Apple app that set it apart and make it appeal to certain people. Then you've got Castro, which is more of a queue-based management style. It takes a very different approach than Overcast. You get everything into an inbox very much like mail, and then you shuffle it off to either the top or bottom of your queue and listen to your podcast in order. And then finally, there are so many others, but there's also Pocket Casts, which is another one that I like a lot, which has a really strong design, great ways to discover new podcasts, and filtering, much like the music apps, by things like the play state, the release date, whether it's video or audio, that sort of thing, which sets it apart from some of the other podcast apps in the category. So another category that's just about as deep, I think, as the task managers and the reminders app is weather. There are so many different weather apps of all different breeds and types. I know John Gruber once said that Twitter apps were a design playground for developers, and that's really true of weather as well, because there's all kinds of weather apps for all sorts of different needs. Some of my favorites are Dark Sky and Weatherline. Those two are very different in the way they approach weather. Dark Sky does a great job of showing you, at least in the US, I know it's not quite as good in Europe, but does a great job of showing you when it's about to rain and giving you radar of the entire country, wherever you happen to be. And Weatherline takes a linear graph approach, showing you what the temperature and conditions are going to be hour by hour throughout the day. But then you've got others like Weather Underground, which does a great job with Europe, and Hello Weather, which I know Federico talked about on a recent episode. And if you are a complete weather geek, you can go even deeper and get something like RadarScope, which we talked about on an earlier episode as well, which has incredible detail about the weather conditions and the radar and that sort of thing. Our thanks to Linea by the Iconfactory for sponsoring App Stories this week. Linea is an iPad drawing app that strikes a great balance between powerful tools and usability. Linea just got a big update that features iCloud Sync, so your drawings are wherever you need them on all your devices, and you can access them via iCloud Drive too. There's a great companion Mac app that was just released called Linea Link that's great for previewing your drawings on your Mac and moving them to other apps like Sketch, Pixelmator, Acorn, Photoshop, and more. Check out the show notes for links to Linea and Linea Link. Thanks again to Linea by the Iconfactory for sponsoring App Stories.
The oddball case really is Apple Mail, because Mail can be so complex in terms of the kind of backend, talking to different email services, and the kind of integrations that you need to have with multiple email providers, dealing with the user accounts and syncing those emails and push notifications, search. it is difficult to build an email client. And yet at the same time, there's so much competition going on for email on the App Store. Perhaps not as much as task management and weather apps, but definitely in the top three. And that is because Apple Mail just feels so behind. At least until iOS 10, Apple Mail really has lagged, not only behind its Mac counterpart, but also in general compared to the kind of innovation that is going on in the email market. And it feels like ever since Dropbox acquired Mailbox, what used to be their own email client, that sort of launched this new era of innovative email apps with modern features such as gestures to deal with messages in the inbox and snoozing messages until a later date. It feels to me like developers have been building upon that foundation. Of course, Mailbox was eventually discontinued by Dropbox, but there are still so many modern email clients on the App Store today. And just a few examples: Spark by Riddle. I think it's the best free alternative to mail for everyone. Apps like Airmail, which take the integrations with third-party apps and automation to the next level on iOS. Polymail, which is more perhaps geared towards team usage, so you can collaborate with a team on tackling the same shared inbox. You can keep track of statistics, such as when someone opens your message, when someone reads your message or clicks a link in a message. If you're part of a support team, for example, that can be quite useful to deal with customers and people emailing the support email address of your company. To alternatives like, for example, Inbox and Gmail by Google, with Inbox that was the more sophisticated and modern take on Gmail that is now kind of blending into the main Gmail app again with features such as automatic categorization of messages and automatic replies generated by machine learning. There's stuff like Outlook, for example, that was acquired by Microsoft and later sort of rebranded as Outlook, and it's this powerful all-in-one email client that combines a calendar and app integrations, and it's also free to use, and it's got fast search, notifications, snoozing, gestures. It seems to me like there's a new standard for third-party email clients, and because it's so difficult and yet the potential is so high that a lot of companies and a lot of indie shops and bigger developers alike have been trying to fix email and to sort of provide a better solution for iOS users. I think it's quite fun to try different email apps and to see the common trends underneath the different design choices and the different features for iPhone and iPad users. I know that I'm guilty of trying too many different email apps, and I'm probably not going to stop anytime soon. But, in my defense, it's kind of fun. So we're going to talk about apps that are impossible to replace and maybe follow up on some other categories in a future episode. But at least for now, aside from the apps that Apple is not going to open up and that Apple is not going to let users replace on iOS, it feels to me like there's a lot of choice for users in terms of finding different apps, alternatives to Apple's apps that are more powerful or that have a more intuitive design, more innovative features, and that feel more modern. And I know that it can be quite a shock for developers to discover that Apple is entering the same category, the same market, the same niche that they are occupying at the moment. But I think it's important to remember that for every default Apple app, there's millions of users who want more and who are looking for a different design, a different feature set, and that they want to use something else that fits their needs better. So it is true that share locking can be a problem, but as we've seen, Safari reading list didn't kill Instapaper or Pocket, and calendar apps are probably going to stick around even if they're not as flexible as the Apple Calendar. And as we see, there are plenty of alternatives to Notes, even if Notes is free and has collaboration, and it's actually quite a great app. There's still people looking for different note-taking apps. So even if Apple is present in a category, I think there's still lots of room for third-party developers to innovate and to create different solutions.
Yeah, that's right. And I think I look at it sometimes as though, especially with things like calendar app, if someone moves from a paper calendar to the iOS calendar app, that's kind of the training wheels that gets them used to an app. And at some point, a certain number of those people are going to think to themselves, this is a great app, but, and there's the but is going to be the something more that they need to get whatever they need to get done. And so that's where something like Time Page or Fantastical comes in and can fill that void and appeal to that pro user. So in that sense, if you look at it from that angle, I think in some respects, Apple is actually helping develop these markets for third-party developers, and hopefully they will continue to do so for a long time. Well, that's it for this week, folks. Thanks again to our sponsors, Zapier and Linea by the Iconfactory. If you're listening on the web in our handy player, thank you for listening, and consider subscribing in a podcast app so you can get every single episode automatically delivered to you each week. You can find both of us online writing at macstories.net and for Club Mac Stories. Federico is at Viticci on Twitter. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees on Twitter. JOHNVOORHEES. And you can always follow the show as well, App Stories Net. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.